So our starting point was that one of the reasons why islands are still a hot topic, as this conference shows, has to do with the fact that successive cyclic movement is still poorly understood. So in this talk, we will try to account for some islands by trying to clarifying the nature of successive cyclic movement. But before doing that, we need to set some background, so I will do that. And the first piece of background has to do with labels and how labels are determined in syntax. So as for labels, we think that a definition like one in your handout is probably something that cannot really avoid it. So one says that when two objects, alpha and beta, are merged, a subset of the feature of either alpha or beta become the label of a newly created object. And what does a label do? Well, it does two things, basically. The first one, a label triggers further computation inside the object which is created, if further computation is needed. This is the inside part. And the second role of label is that labels are visible from outside the syntactic object, for example, for selection. So something like that is probably not too much controversial. And the next step is asking a more difficult question, maybe. So how are labels determined? And here we rely on our previous work, and in our previous work we have proposed what we have called the probing algorithm, and in fact this work builds on works by other people, including Chomsky. And probing algorithm says this: the label of a syntactic object alpha beta is the feature which acts as the probe of the merging operation creating alpha beta. So the idea is that when you have merge and you have one of the two elements, which is the probe, if you want, the trigger of merge, then that element provides the label. So 2 immediately derives one of the basic facts that any version of phrase structure theory has to derive, namely that the target of movement projects. However, 2 can work in a larger set of cases. For example, if you assume that selection is a sort of probing, then the probing algorithm says that the selector provides the label. And finally, the probing algorithm works in another fundamental case as well, namely when a head has to project in traditional terms or provides the label. In order to do that, the probing algorithm has to be coupled with the idea that lexical items come with a feature, which Chomsky has called edge feature. And this feature says basically that a lexical item has to be merged with other elements to form phrases or clauses and sentences and so on. So the edge feature is the initial clue of any derivation. So by virtue of having this feature, which says I have to be attached to something else, a lexical item is a probe. And by virtue of being a probe, it can provide the label. It can provide the label in, say, head complement configuration. Okay, basically this is very roughly the idea and how probing algorithm is supposed to work. Now, very briefly, we illustrate this probing algorithm with a case that we have discussed elsewhere, so we will be quick here, and the case is, of course, cases like 3, in which you have a structure like what you read. Okay, here there is what can be called a labeling conflict. On the one hand, what, by virtue of being a lexical item, can provide the label, as we just said, and so you have the 3 relative readings in 3b. I read what you read, DP distribution, because what, being a D, provides the label D. On the other hand, comp, embedded comp, is ultimately responsible for WH movement, so it can also provide the label, and this explains the reading in 3a, I wonder what you read. And crucially for our purposes, whenever you have something like what book, things change, so look at 4b, I read what book you read, this is deviant, and in this framework, the reason is that what book is not a lexical item, so it cannot provide the label. So the only reading which is available is the one in 4a, I wonder what book you read, in which comp provides the label. Okay, so this was very, very roughly the say, general background information. Next step that will lead us closer to islands has to do with a question, a general question. The question is, are there label-less nodes in syntax, so layer with no label? Are they admitted? Or, well, in a sense, they should be admitted if we assume that merge, by being the very fundamental operation that creates structures, is free. However, the idea of free merge is dangerous because, of course, if merge were unconstrained and free, there would be no basis to say that there are grammatical constraints. So you want to be very, very restrictive and say that free merge, namely unprobed merge, is something which does not happen for free. Well, the system based on 1 and 2 can help. Why? Because what 2 says basically is that if you don't have a probe, you don't have a label. Okay? 2 relates labels to probe. So free merge in principle can take place, but the resulting object would have no label. So is this possibility tested in natural language? In this talk, we will explore this possibility very, very briefly. One obvious candidate for a label-less object is root clauses. Why? Because they don't need any further computation and they do not need to be selected. Other possibilities that have been proposed in the recent literature is, for example, intermediate step of successive cyclic movement. This has been proposed by several people very recently, for example, Blumel, Chomsky, and Tom. And finally, another possible candidate is the node resulting when a real adjunct is attached to, say, the causal spine. I mean, these are candidates that needs to be investigated. Okay?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So let's start from clauses. Okay. So there is a sense in which clauses are really unique objects in syntax, in that they can be root. So they are complete syntactic objects in a sense which is completely different from other objects. You can an utterance can be complete if it contains a clause, basically. So this is the idea underlying the notion that clauses are phases or strong phases. So they are complete syntactic objects. And the idea of PIC and of cyclicity is that once you have built such a complete syntactic object which can live on its own, you can get rid of it, its internal structure, and you can unload your computational space for this and sending it to the interface. Okay, so we believe that if clauses can be root and are, because they are complete, they can also have no label. Okay, this comes for free given what we've said, because since a label is something which is needed for further computation, if a clause is a root, it does not need any further computation, no trigger for it, and so no label. This derives for free the possible existence of movements like 1 in 6, in which something moves to the edge of a clause, of a root clause, without being probed. Okay, this would be a case of unprobed internal merge. It will yield an unlabeled syntactic object, but this will make no harm to the derivation, since this is a cycle and the clause is a root, so it does not need to be visible or to trigger further computation. So this approach opens a path which we won't really explore here, the path in which the cases of dislocation, topicalization, focalization, these kinds of structure information feeding movements might be interpreted along these lines as cases of unprobed movement to the edge of a clause, which can then get interpreted as topics, focuses, etc. at the interface. Of course, there will be a difference between a root clause and an embedded clause, okay? Because as soon as a clause gets embedded, it does need it will need a label because it needs to be visible from the rest of the derivation and so on. So we also predict that there should be asymmetries between root and embedded phenomena concerning this type of free movements. And in fact, such cases have been reported in the literature for a variety of languages. And at the end of session 4, you find some scattered reference to these kinds of phenomena showing an asymmetry between topicalizations which are attested in root clauses but which are not possible in embedded clauses. Okay, so let's go back now to clauses again and to the label-less clause. Okay, so we believe that since clauses are cycles, are complete syntactic objects, they can be label-less. They can host unprobed movement, like say, for example, 7, which would be the same example as 6. But then, as soon as the sentence gets embedded, it needs a label. So you have to have a way of getting a label out of a label-less structure, we claim, okay? So suppose you have 7, and in a parallel way, you build up the derivation for a different clause, say 8, you think. At a certain point, you want to merge the two clauses, and 7 and 8 should be merged. And 7, which is a root clause in the cycle, will need to become an embedded clause. So this means that the label-less layer in 7 must be destroyed because the matrix verb think must be able to select for C, and this can be done by vacating the unprobed moved phase. So this entails that which book in 9 will need to move, okay? So this explains the escape hatch status of the edge of the strong phase without, we believe, stipulating it as in the current formulation of the PIC. What really we have to keep in mind giving the cyclic derivation is that it is not so much the head and the edge which are exempted from the completion of the cycle, but really the label, okay? And since edge can be label-less, then it can be survive to the completion of the cycle. Okay, so this would derive a successive cyclic movement along lines which are very similar to recent proposals by Chomsky, by Tom, and by Blumen, 2011. Okay, given this framework, embedded WH questions such as 10, I wonder which book Mary likes, do not constitute a problem since we claim very standard way that which book here is not a case of unprobed movement, but a case of probed movement. So the complementizer here is interrogative, so it is endowed with a feature which probes for the WH element. So as a result, given the probing algorithm in 2, the structure receives a label, and so the edge does not need to be vacated. And the same goes right for the WH head movement structures that we have discussed. Carlo has discussed free relatives and so on. Okay, so now we are really getting close to strong islands and to the real topic of the talk. Okay, so let's first check what goes wrong with free relatives, okay? So free relatives are strong islands. A premise, here we will discuss free relatives which are the most natural ones in Italian. So the data will come from Italian because the contrasts here are very sharp. And in Italian, who free relatives are perfectly natural. So something like who has phoned will be punished is a very perfectly natural free relative. The same in French, the same in Spanish. For some reasons that we don't understand, who free relatives in English are bad, okay? But this is something that we can't explain. So let's focus on Italian, where who has phoned will be punished is perfect with embedding a relative clause interpretation, okay? So given 13, look at 14 and 15. This is a well-known contrast. So the contrast shows that with an interrogative, when you extract from an interrogative, you have a WH island, so a mild violation, since here it is an adjunct that moves, an argument that moves. In 15, where you extract from the free relative, the contrast is very bad. And the violation is very strong. Okay, so this is interesting because here we have, in our analysis, exactly the same kind of embedded WH movement. So you have the key, who, moving to the edge of the embedded CP. And the only difference between 14 and 15 concerns labeling. So in the interrogative case where key does not provide the label, the structure is a weak island. In free relatives where key provides the label, the structure is completely out. Okay, so we believe that there is something here which is really interesting. So let's try to explain this contrast. First of all, it is clear that in both cases, the other double-edged element, to a quale ragazzo, to which boy, has moved to the edge of the root clause by passing through an intermediate step, because there is a phase there and you need to pass through its edge. This step involves a temporary unlabeling of the structure because it is unprobed. And this temporary unlabeling of the structure needs to be destroyed by successive cyclic movement. This is our account of successive cyclic movement. So in 14, which is the indirect interrogative, this is possible because we are assuming that a clause can be labelless as far as it is not further embedded. So to which boy in 14 can move to the edge of the not yet embedded clause, if we assume that the derivation of the matrix and the embedded clause proceed in parallel. Of course, and as soon as the two clauses get merged together, the labelless layer needs to be eliminated, and this forces the double-edged element a quale ragazzo, or to which boy, to move further, and you derive 14 prime. In 15, on the other hand, who, key, provides the label to the embedded structure. So it is not a clause, but it is a DP. But a DP cannot be a root in the intuitive sense in which a clause can be. It is not complete syntactic object. It is not a cycle in this sense. This means that it cannot be labelless in our account. Okay? Only something which is complete, which is an utterance on its own, can be labelless, and DPs are not. So, as a consequence, in 15 prime, to which boy, a quale ragazzo, cannot move unprobed to the edge of this DP, because this would give a labelless layer to something which needs a label. Another possible derivation would be as in 15 prime. So suppose that you first move which boy, to which boy, a quale ragazzo, at the edge of the clause. This would be an unprobed movement. It would yield an unlabeled syntactic object, and this is okay since we are at the root of the cycle. However, at that point, you are in trouble for moving key, who, because if you want to prove it, to move it probed, you can't do this because the structure has no label, and by the definition of label, you need a label in order to trigger further computation. So C cannot move probed to, who cannot move probed to the complementizer edge. If on the other hand you try to move who or key unprobed, then and then there key provides the label for the structure, because we are discussing here the interpretation in which we have a free relative. So you move a quale ragazzo unprobed, you have a labelless layer. Then you move again key unprobed, and you have another labelless layer, which you destroy by having key providing the label. Then you end up with something wrong, which is a labelless layer embedded within a syntactic object, which is not allowed, we believe. So summarizing, we believe that the strong islandhood of free relatives is due to an incompatibility between a labelless movement and a labeling movement, which is typical of free relatives. Let me quickly now mention other causal adjuncts. Okay, so free relatives are not the only strong islands that we have. So we believe that a number of adjunct clauses, notably when clauses, where clauses, how clauses, can be reduced in their analysis to free relatives, and so receive exactly the same explanation that we just provided. Why so? Well, because first of all, they are introduced by a bare double-edged element, when, where, how, etc. And also their interpretation is roughly equivalent to that of a free relative. This has been noticed by many. Okay, so very roughly, if I say I sweat when he talks to the president in 16, this is roughly equivalent to I sweat in the moment in which he talks to the president. So if we assume that these structures are free relatives, then their strong islandhood can be explained along the same lines just presented in terms of an incompatibility between a labelless movement and a labeling movement. Let me mention also here, since I won't have time to go back to this at the end of the talk, if clauses. There is a special session of if clauses in your handout, but don't go to it. Let me just mention that it is, of course, less direct to claim that if clauses are free relatives, because if is not a double-edged element, and so things appear to be more indirect. But we believe that also if clauses can be successfully analyzed as free relatives. There is an analysis much detailed by Bat and Pancheva claiming just this, that if clauses are indeed free relatives. And it's based on various evidence coming from cross-linguistic facts showing that in many cases, like in German, if clauses might be introduced by a double-edged element like when, and also interpretive facts really showing that if clauses are free relatives. So a number of adjuncts, of clausal adjuncts, which are strong islands, could be derived, could have their status as strong islands derived in the same way as we derived the strong island status of free relatives, okay?
Okay. Now, of course, there are other islands we want to say something about. Complex MP constraint, obviously. And let us start from relative clauses, which are, a very well-attested case of strong islands, of course. Here we rely on a specific version of the raising analysis for relative clauses. This is a version that Caterina and I have developed in previous work, and I just very briefly summarize it for our purposes now. So look at 20 as an illustration. I like the journal that reviewed that book. What we propose is a version of a raising analysis in which what raises is a noun, okay, in this case journal, and by virtue of being a lexical item, the noun has the power, so to say, to relabel the structure, namely a clause becomes a nominal constituent, which is, of course, what you want, because basically the reason why relative clauses are so interesting is that they are closed with a nominal distribution. And by doing so, movement of the noun provides the external determiner with the right type of object, namely an MP. Of course, this analysis faces the problem that there are cases in which the head of a relative clause is a phrase. Okay, so something like, I like the Journal of Linguistics that reviewed that book. What we said in our work is that all these cases are cases in which any modifier of the noun of the relative clause is late merged after the noun has moved and has provided the right label to the structure. Of course, this is not standard and needs to be motivated. We have done that extensively elsewhere. If you want, we can go back to this in the question time, but that will be a different talk, okay? So now we have to worry about islands. Now, assuming that this analysis is more or less right, why is 21 bad? 21 is a classical cases of strong islands. So which book do I like the journal that reviewed? Okay, here the explanation is more or less similar to the one we saw for free relatives, modulo the differences between free relatives and full relatives. The basic difference is that in free relatives, D moves, while in full relatives, in our story, N moves. Okay, so we have to exclude two possible derivations for 21. The first derivation is in 22 in your handout. What happens here is that first, which book moves, and again moves with no trigger, no probe, so you have a label-less layer. Then journal has to move, okay, in order to have a relative clause. But here there is a problem. The problem is that a label-less layer cannot probe anything, okay? given the label is what triggers further computation. So journal cannot move. By analogy, what we said about free relatives, if journals moves unprobed, and only later it provides the label, the output is still bad because there will be a labelless layer inside the root, the labelless layer immediately above which book, okay? So again, you will have an embedded labelless object, and we assume that this is not good. The other possible derivation what we have to exclude is 23, in which journal moves first, okay? It provides the right label, and then which book has to move. And again, the explanation here is the same as the case with free relatives. Here, you will have a labelless layer on the top of a nominal constituent. And labelless layers are possible by assumption, and by a reasonable assumption, we believe only on the top of closure constituents, okay? Now, this is meant to derive one side of a complex NP constraints. But of course, the complex NP constraint has another side, which is the case of extraction out of a complement of a noun. One example is 24, which paper did you make the claim that Mary wrote? Don't take the star here too seriously. I mean, we are saying that it is deviant. As our said, it is very possible that it is less deviant than relative clauses, but still it's deviant. So here our story cannot extend to these cases, okay? What should we say? Well, we have a suspect, and the suspect is that it is possible that what is taking place with this side of a complex NP constraint is that a confounding is at place. First of all, think about this. Each noun can be modified by a relative clause, but only a small subset of noun can take a clausal complement. So imagine that you are in a situation like 25, the noun that, okay? At this point, it is reasonable to think that if you have to guess how the structure will go on, you will go for the relative clause interpretation. Okay, but if you go for the relative clause interpretation, you are in trouble because, as we just said, the relative clause interpretation triggers a Highlands effect. Then you realize that what follows n in this case is not a relative clause, but say the complement. At this time, you have to do reanalysis, but this is costly, and so what we are suggesting is that it is possible that here there is a generalized sort of garden path effect, and this explains the so-called islands effect with this structure, okay, which are islands in the sense that, they are resulting of a reanalysis after an analysis that has triggered an islands effect. Okay, that's the idea. We have evidence for this garden path approach, at least for languages like Italian, and the evidence is in 27 and 28 in your handout. So 27 is, say, more or less classical complex NP constraint. So quale paese hanno dato l'ordine che invadessero? Which country did they give the order that they invade? This is I say, typical complex NP constraint. 28 is better. So 28 is quale paese hanno dato l'ordine di invadere, so which country did they give the order to invade. So the difference between 27 and 28 is that the complement of the noun in 28 is an infinitival clause, while in 27 is a finite clause. Now, it is not the case that 28 is better because in general extracting out of an infinitival clause in Italian is easier, because there are cases in which this is very bad. This, for example, is in 29. However, there is an effect that can explain why 28 is better, and the fact is that in Italian there are no infinitival relative clauses introduced by D, the complementizer D. Okay, so basically in 28 you cannot be a garden pathed, okay, because there is no moment in which the structure is ambiguous between a relative clause interpretation and the noun complement interpretation. So this would be evidence that at least for Italian, the garden path analysis is at least worth considering. I think we have 2 minutes or so.
2 minutes.
Okay, so
So
very
in 2
quick.
minutes I will conclude. So I will first point to view that there is an interesting. There is an interesting session in the handout that we haven't gone through, which is 11, and it concerns because clauses. So just very, very briefly, because clauses cannot be, we believe, cannot be analyzed as free relatives. So they are clausal adjuncts, but they are not free relatives. This is because the interpretation and the integration of the interpretation of the because clause to that of the root clause is much different. So we would like to take a different path for explaining them, and it's an interesting one. Capitalizing on something that we have left open, namely the possibility that not only internal merge, namely movement, can be unprobed, but also external merge can be unprobed. So the idea is that real adjuncts, like because clauses, are syntactic objects which are externally merged, but are unprobed, so they are not selected. This has the cost of yielding an unlabeled syntactic object as a result, and this entails that you can only do this operation post-cyclically, so when you have completed your derivation, because as long as your derivation is active, you need labels. So you only can get rid of, be happy without a label, either at the root of a cycle or post-cyclically. So because clauses would be later inserted, and that's why they resist extraction, because double-edge movement is overt, so cannot happen post-cyclically, let's say. And really, the conclusions are clear. I just have to apologize. This is not a complete story about islands. Of course, many islands were left outside the account, so we didn't talk about subject islands because we think they are a different phenomenon and we don't have much to say about them. We didn't talk about weak islands like double-edge islands and the like, because we believe that for them we have already an existing working account which is necessary given the derivational approach, the cyclic approach, and it is the minimal link or relativizing minimality approach. And I will stop here. Yes.
Again, a comment and a question. The comment is there is a missing piece of the literature in your references that you may want to take a look at. It's Hornstein's recent book from Cambridge University Press, The Theory of Syntax, where the theory of violence proposed there is that its unlabeled structures should be islands, and you might be interested in taking a look at that. And then the question is, what about the phenomenon of island repair? Setting aside whether we really believe those are repaired or not, but how would an approach like yours even allow for instances of movement that are then licit if the unlabeled structure is elided? I couldn't see why that should make any difference in your approach.
Yeah. Do you want to answer? So, I mean, the honest answer is that we haven't thought at all about the island, the deletion, repair by deletion, okay? So the first time we thought about it was today during Howard's talk.
That's okay. I mean, the honest answer is fine.
But I don't know. So we have to think about it, and I think there are some interesting things to think about. But please, we need more time, because really, I mean, we just simply didn't think about them. So sorry about that.
Please take it. There is no problem.
Well,
but it could be that deletion. Suppose the problem is a label-less layer, which cannot be embedded by definition because it has to be the root. So perhaps deleting the whole structure is a way of not having it embedded. So it could be that deleting. So you have a label-less layer, and then you move and you label the structure. You know, for example, in the free relative derivation. Suppose you first move and probed the double-edge element which needs to be extracted, and then you move the who, and which labels the structure, right? Then the problem was about the derivation was that you had a label-less layer which is embedded. Perhaps if in that situation you deleted, this goes, but I don't know why.
I'm skeptical because the elided portions typically have a particular identity. Like
yeah, sure.
They have a label.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so Caterina gave the honest answer. The dishonest one is that while I was listening to Howard's talk, I was saying, okay, there are different ways. Which one is the best to be coupled with our story? And since we were talking about relative clauses, maybe the ones on the market which is more compatible is saying that the input structure of sluicing is what Howard called the short. Yes, so maybe something like that if tenable. But again, this is dishonest. So the honest one is we have to work on.
So the answer, yes, it would be that the relative clauses cannot be rescued by deletion. Yes, yeah, but really.
So this is an account for relativization and things that can be reduced to relativization, like most adjunct islands. Most, not all of them. Okay, so.
Can you hear me? Yeah. There's some sort of last resort flavor to your labeling algorithm, right? Like repairing strategies or something like this.
Not in the labeling algorithm, as far as I can see. Why do you think?
I haven't meant something like what you say in the first sentence in section 5. Like, what happens is if a labelless clause needs to be embedded. In principle, the clause itself shouldn't care about embedding, right? I mean, it is either embedded or not, but it doesn't know whether it's going to be embedded until it is embedded.
Yeah, in fact, that's what we're claiming. That we're claiming that at the cycle level, it is a root clause. Even if it's going to be embedded, this doesn't. The clause is not going to care about that. It acts as if it were root until the end of the cycle. So it can be labelless. Any clause can be labelless because it is a complete syntactic object. The only difference comes when you try to merge this with another clause when you try to embed it.
Yeah, but then it's like a last resort operation of labeling the thing, right? Because otherwise you couldn't merge it with whatever is selecting it. But the question is that there's some sort of global look ahead in the labeling algorithm because the clause itself doesn't know that it's going to be embedded until it is embedded, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how global it is. Basically, imagine that you have two parallel derivations. At a certain point, you check if you can merge them. So you don't need to know what's going to happen in the next steps. You know that think, in this case, as to select for something, and then you see that in 7, the structure as it is not good, but if you move which book. So I mean, I wouldn't say that it is global. It's certainly the case that you have to do something in order for 7 to be embedded under 8. Yes, that's the idea that the successive cyclic movement is a way to destroy a labelless layer. I wouldn't call it global. Maybe it's, in this sense, it might be some kind of residual last resort. Yes, that's possible.
Yeah, I was intrigued by what you had to say about the difference between relative clause islands and noun complement islands. And as you mentioned, I had talked about the fact that the widespread observation that the noun complement ones aren't as strong. Another thing I talked about that I think might also follow from what you said, or come close to following, is that the infinitival noun complements are basically perfect. And in the infinitival noun complements, you won't be garden path, like, which book did you talk about plans to read? And there's nothing there that would suggest to you that it's going to be a relative clause, so maybe that would be fine. Interestingly enough, infinitival relative clauses, though, are still quite bad. So something like, which floor did you talk about a man to wash? Seems quite bad to me. And I think that's pretty close, that distinction, too, is pretty close to following from what you have to say.
Okay, so you would say that what we are saying for Italian could be extended to English, maybe?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Aritze's question because I just don't understand how you envisage merge to work. So I thought we're starting with a model where you're taking lexical items and you merge them, but then on your handout in 8 you say that you're merging. So on page 4, 7, and 8 you're saying that you're merging 8 with 7, and that looks like you're doing Edwin Williams or something, level embedding. And you know, if you're doing level embedding, then Edwin has various ways of deriving island constraints that are somewhat related to what you're saying, but I thought you wanted merge of lexical items. So can you clarify that for me?
Okay.
I mean, if you do bottom-up merge, right? Then you take 7
Yeah.
and you merge that with think, and at that point you have exactly the same problem. If that's the way the derivation goes, then at that point, when think is merged with the object that you have written down there in 7, then the configuration is identical to the one where you're extracting out of a relative clause, where you have an embedded unlabeled structure. And the only way you can avoid that is if you sort of build up the matrix and then sort of insert the complement clause down in there. But that's not the... maybe that's what you're assuming, but that's not minimalist merge, right? That's level embedding.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that what is crucial is that think at a certain point needs to select for a clause, basically. Okay, so the way we put it is that you have a parallel derivation for the matrix and the embedded clause.
I don't think that the parallel merging that plays such a crucial role, and I don't think that if we think that think as a lexical item merges with the embedded clause, this would give us the same configuration as the free relative. Because there you have think, which is searching for a syntactic object, which is there, but it has a layer which is labelless. Okay, so what we are claiming is that it is able to merge with the syntactic object, forcing the evacuation of the labelless layer. But this is not what happens with who in the free relatives, because in the free relative case, it is internal merging from the syntactic object, so which cannot attach to the. So it happens in the same syntactic object, which is a C, but also a D. So I wouldn't say that. I mean, I don't think that this way of presenting the facts plays a crucial role. So I don't think we are buying any Williams story, okay? I think we can be happy with the step-by-step derivation by which it is always a lexical item which merges with the syntactic object. So maybe it was, I don't know, we thought that it was better to present it this way, but it doesn't play a crucial role. Yeah. The point is that here, think, what we're claiming is that think is able to see the category it searches for, it probes by selection, and this can be, and it can merge with it by forcing this evacuation. This cannot happen in relative clauses because it is a case of relabeling internal merge.
I think you run into the problem regardless, but it's going to take a bit longer to...
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay, maybe a last question, and then we... Okay. Even better.
Yeah. I was thinking of the examples in the complex NP constraint in Greek. So it is a kind of cross-linguistic evidence for your account. There is a split in the complex NP constraint in Greek, having to do with the fact that you can extract out of a complex NP involving a complement clause, but you cannot extract out of a complex NP involving a relative clause. Now, the crucial point is that the complementizer for the complement clause is different than the complementizer of the relative clause. So there is no way to reanalyze the complex NP construction as a relative clause, and then you can easily
do the extraction. So this again is some kind of garden path effect, and this explains the asymmetry in Greek, I think, in a very good way.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.